Good afternoon and welcome to the conversation sponsored by the pastors of Kansas Avenue Seventh-day Adventist Church. It is our privilege to be back on streaming live again. We took a few weeks off just to get a breather, catch our breath, and to regroup, but we are glad to be back with you all. And we want to thank our loyal audience, those who view week by week by week, and who comment and who tell us how much that they have enjoyed the conversation and been blessed. We thank you for participating by watching and being part of the viewership and by spreading the word. And if you're watching this via Facebook or YouTube, we just ask that you would just share this from one page to another so that we can grow our audience, because we do believe that things that we will be talking about will not only bless you, but it will definitely bless somebody else. And we have with us today current and former law enforcement officers. So this promises to be a very informative discussion with them on today. I want to have a word of prayer with you all, and then we're going to allow them to introduce themselves. Then we'll get right into our conversation. Let's bow our heads. Father in heaven, thank you again for yet another day and another time to talk and discuss. And we just ask that you would be present with us and all those who view, that we will gain understanding and some unity. In the name of Jesus, we ask. Amen. I have my partner with me, Pastor Edwin McBride, youth pastor of the Kansas Avenue SDA Church. I'm Pastor Michael Jenkins, the administrative pastor there at the Kansas Avenue Church in Riverside. In the background, our senior pastor, Ainsworth Keith Morris, and we also have Hansel Fletcher in the background, who helps us with many things to keep the conversation flowing. So now let me allow those who are with us today to introduce themselves. We have Bill Howe and Hugh Forbes, Chief Larry Gonzalez, Oliver Thompson, Valmont Graham, another member of the Riverside Police Department. So let's start with Bill Howe. Bill, you have been a chief of police before. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and your history in law enforcement.
Started law enforcement in 1964. I'm a little late getting started because I was an airman at March Air Force Base in Riverside. And when I decided to get out after 14 years, I joined the Riverside Sheriff's Department and later joined the Air Force Reserves. So I spent 14 years active in the Air Force, 28 in the Reserves. I went from a private to a lieutenant colonel, retired lieutenant colonel. And Sheriff's Department, I spent 12 years with them. And after seeing that I wasn't going to get promoted and things like this that come up later, wouldn't get promoted any higher, I left and went to the Corona, California Police Department as a lieutenant. That had never happened before. And I was the first African American hired by that department. And after 7 years there, I became the chief of police at the University of California Riverside Police Department. And also I attended the FBI National Academy. I'm a 3-school graduate of Riverside City College, Cal State Los Angeles, and University of Southern California, LA. And I was also a teacher at several institutions. And that's just some of my background. I won't take up all the time. Okay.
All right, thank you. Very experienced. Now we want to go to the Riverside Police Chief, Larry Gonzalez.
Thank you, Pastor Jenkins, and thank you for having me on the show. Larry Gonzalez, I'm going on my 28th year here at the Riverside Police Department. It's the only agency that I've been with my entire adult life, pretty much. So became the 22nd chief of Riverside PD in January. I actually started off as the interim a year ago in September, but got the official notification for the job in January. It's like I said, throughout my career, I've worked all the assignments going through the ranks, and been involved with the community heavily for the last 20 years. And probably is the reason why I'm here today is because of my community, my relationships with the community. But I'm also a graduate of the FBI National Academy, probably much later than Bill Howe went to the academy, but I did go, and graduated from Southern Illinois University. Also, Senior Management Institution for Policing. It's out of Harvard University. It's a 3-week command college in Boston, which was a pleasure to go to. I went to that in 2016. But the real education I've had is just throughout the years here in the city of Riverside, and dealing with this department and the community has been an absolute pleasure. I think I'm the first inside chief in about 25 years. We've always had to go outside for police chiefs. And, probably rightfully so. We were in turmoil, which we will probably talk about during this conversation, when we were looking for chiefs in the past. But when I took over this year, the last chief, Sergio Diaz, left the department in pretty good shape. So I was able to slide in as an inside guy, and I'm looking forward to it. And I'm honored to be with the guests that are here today. So thank you
All
very
right,
much.
and thank you for taking time from your day to be present with us. And so we want to go to Valmont Graham. Just tell us a little about yourself as well, please. I think you're still muted.
Can
There you
you
go.
hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. So thank you, Pastor Jenkins, and thank you for all on the panel, anyone who's watching. And it'd be easier, you just call me Val. But I've been a resident of Riverside since 1973. So when I was 8 years of age, I've been in Riverside. So I had the pleasure of going to the school systems, including RCC. And I also joined the Riverside Police Department in 1989. Prior, I did 3 years from 1986 to 1989 with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. I had the pleasure of working with Chief Thompson. And I have been a resident of Riverside, what I'm most proud of. But as far as policing, 30 years at the Riverside Police Department, I retired at the rank of lieutenant. I had the pleasure to work a lot of different assignments, including the East Side Area Commander. And it's been a pleasure to have that ability as a citizen of Riverside and also 30 years with the police department. I retired in August of 2019. And for the past 2 years, I have also been associate professor at Riverside City College for criminal justice.
All right. Wonderful. Amen. Oliver Thompson, please talk to us. Tell us a little bit about yourself as well.
Hi, thank you for having me. And thank you, Bill, for the invitation of getting in touch with me. I've been a Riverside resident since 1963. I was in the Air Force. When I went into law enforcement, please understand, I had no desire to be a police officer. See, I left high school in 1960, and I went off to college to be a Baptist minister, if you can believe that. I served there in college, Southwestern College, Winfield, Kansas, a Methodist school for 1 year. And when I came home for the summertime in 1961, if my rearing mom had extended the curfew, I would not be here today. But she told me the curfew was 9 o'clock. And after being at college for a whole year, that was too much for me. And so I left from there and went in the Air Force. And that's when I ran into Bill Howe. Education-wise, RCC, Cal State LA, and my graduate studies at University of Southern California in the area of master's degree and doctoral in public administration. Law enforcement, I started there in 1965, at the end of 1965. And even though I was still in the military, they worked out that kind of an agreement. I stayed at Riverside Sheriff until 1991, worked all the way through. I was the first person of color to be promoted to the command ranks, chief deputy. And then from that point, I left and went to Inglewood Police Department. And I can tell anyone that that's where my real education in law enforcement began. Riverside Sheriff was like K-12. When I left there and went to Inglewood, I graduated into in the graduate school. Those 4 years in undergraduate was okay, but the real graduate studies came about when I stayed there. I stayed there and left there in 1998, came to Riverside, and I've been there teaching at RCC as professor of justice studies. That's it.
All right. Thank you. Hugh Forbes. Want to talk to us, Brother Hugh, and tell us about yourself as well. You're muted. Let me unmute you there. All right, go ahead.
Thank you, Brother Pastor. Thank you for the invitation. As you said, my name is Hugh Forbes. I was a deputy sheriff for one of the largest, for the largest county in the United States. I served there for 5 years with the department. Currently, I'm an educator with one of the local school districts in California here, where I'm trying to make hope happen for students in the inner city. I have an AA degree in administration of justice and a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. And just so you know that the Chief Howe, he was one of my professors at the time when I went through college. I also have a master's degree in educational administration. So I'm very happy to be here this evening with the other members of the panel.
Amen. And we're glad to have each and every one of you. And your different experience brings a lot to the table and to this conversation on today. So my first question is about the historical view and relationship between Riverside Police and the African American community in Riverside. Now, at the Kansas Avenue Church, we are familiar with the police. In some ways, we have meetings, regularly scheduled meetings between the Riverside Coalition for Police Accountability that take place within our church, and we're very happy that we're able to host these meetings. But can you all just talk to us and tell us about the relationship between the Riverside Police Department and the African American community in Riverside?
Well, I have to go back a little ways. Before I came to Riverside, I have to go back to my youth when I left Philadelphia in 1950 and got on a train heading to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. I had to get off that train in Cincinnati and get on another train and went to the back. The coaches where they directed the black people. And the coach was filthy, naturally. But when I arrived in San Antonio, there was an Air Force bus to meet us. It took us to the base. And to cut it short, we were holed up in a two-story dorm, and I was on the bottom bunk, and there was a young man on the top bunk, a young Caucasian man. And after a few days, he would sit on the bed beside me, and we would discuss the various things after chow. For those that don't know, chow is after you eat. And one day he told me, he said, "Bill, my parents lied to me." I said, "How's that?" He said, "Well, they told me that," and he used the word colored people, because that's what we were called, plus a few other things. He said we were stupid, we stank, we didn't take baths, all these negative things. He said, "But after I met you, I realized that they lied to me." He said, "You're no different from me, other than the color of your skin." And of course, during my time in service, I met a lot of Southerners, and a lot of them, their minds have changed. I never really ran into any racism in the military, outright racism, but it wasn't until I got out and went into law enforcement. And when I went on the sheriff's department, lived on the east side of Riverside for about 8 or 9 years, I guess, and black people and brown people were treated very badly, very badly. I had people that I knew at March Air Force Base that lived in Riverside would call me and ask me, "Well, why is the Riverside Police Department doing this, doing that, stopping us, getting us out, pointing shotguns at us, and all this sort of thing?" I said, "I don't know. I have no idea." And well, this went on for quite a while. It particularly got bad when 2 officers were ambushed and killed at Boardwalk, just outside of Boardwalk Park at Riverside. I believe that was in 1970, 71. Is that right, Larry? Yeah. And then all hell broke loose after that. But there was a lot of racism going on in Riverside with the police department for a number of years. And things were going on inside the department as well. Racist comments put on the chalkboard in the briefing room, things put on black officers' lockers, and I heard about all this. But it wasn't until Chief Diaz came along about 10 years ago that things started to change. And it's changed immensely now. And I haven't heard any reports of racism going on in the department now. And I'm sure Chief Gonzalez here is going to see that continues. And but anyway, that's all I have to say at this point about that.
But it's good to hear that things have been changing in the right direction. And, those are the types of things that we want to hear and that we hope would continue on. I don't know if there's any of you others that would want to just talk to us briefly before we move on to the next question about the the relationship between the police department, or some things that are in place now to help strengthen the relationship between the African American community and the Riverside Police. Go ahead.
Bill lived on Douglas, and I lived on Dwight, right behind him. And after Teal and Christensen were ambushed, Riverside Police Department made contact with Riverside Sheriff's Department because they didn't have that many black officers except for one who was a detective. And they asked Bill and I to team up and go on the east side of Riverside where we live and talk to people to find out exactly what was going on. I'll never forget when we returned after talking to the residents, because we knew them all. They knew us and we knew them. They knew we were cops and the whole bit. And I remember returning to that debriefing, and this little sergeant was there and he heard what we had to say. And I'll never forget his statement. His statement was, yeah. The same crap that has come from that community over a period of time. And me being a young officer, belligerent, arrogant, the whole bit. And I remember saying to that sergeant, because I was still a deputy going to college and all that. And I remember saying to him, you know, Sarge, where there's smoke, there could be fire.
Mercy. Go ahead, Val.
With
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, well, my perspective, I came to Riverside in 1973. I was 8 years of age. And so as a kid, it was 2 years after the Christian and Teal murders that happened April of 71. So I had a unique perspective being very young. And I lived on the east side during that time period on 12th Street. And it was a lot of tension, but being young, I didn't have appreciation. But the historical viewpoint from seeing the aftermath of how the community didn't trust the police at the time as an 8-year-old. And then later, it was one of the reasons why I wanted to eventually get in law enforcement to make a change. So that was a very significant time period, relationships between Riverside and the Riverside Police Department because of that shooting, which was a national event. So that was really historical for me as well. As I moved on in my career, when I became a police officer, another historical point in the city that's really struck with me on a personal nature was the Taisha Miller shooting. And that was December 28th of 1998. And so that for me as a police officer and the relationship with the Riverside Police Department at the time of the shooting had not really improved as great. But after that, if most people know the history of that shooting, I won't get into the history of it. It forced the city, when I say the city, I'm talking about city government, the residents and the police department, to change from a traditional policing model into more of a community-based policing. So I personally, from that shooting situation, saw from 99 until I retired in 2019, that we did in fact actually turn into a community-based policing where we made an effort to work better with the communities, where prior that wasn't a policing model.
Here, Val, if you could just take a moment just to give us a brief history of that. For those of us who are just coming to Riverside, I've been here 10, 15 years, we're not aware of that and probably didn't even know that Riverside had this kind of a notoriety in some way. But you said it's a pivotal moment pretty much that turned the department into a community department. So if you can just give us just an eye shot, not just the name of it, but what kind of happened, and then we can jump back to the remedy.
Yeah, and I'll be really brief about it because we're talking historical perspective. Again, Christian and Teal was in 71, and it was throughout the United States as a media sensation. Taisha Miller, if anybody want to Google it on their own time, Taisha Miller was December 28th of 1998, and it too was, of course, first from Riverside and became a national event. And the simple summary would be that Taisha Miller, I believe in her early 20s, she had fell asleep in her car at the corner of Central in Brockton at a gas station. Her family called the police department because they could not wake her. Officers came to the scene. They attempted to wake her in her locked car. At some point, someone noticed she had a gun across her lap. From that, a decision was made by the officers on scene that they would try to retrieve the gun, and their tactics They broke the window, and from those tactics, an officer-involved shooting occurred, and it became really controversial because the community and others questioned their tactics of why they would break a window and try to retrieve a gun. And so there was a lot of controversy in the community where a lot of people felt that it was the wrong tactics. And not just for the police department, city hall, elected officials, city manager, et cetera, et cetera. And from my perspective, at the time, I was a sergeant for the Riverside Police Department, although I wasn't present at that scene. And so I saw the friction between the community and city government and became a national event. And it changed the city because the community did not accept the tactics of the officers, and eventually they were fired for it. And so there's a lot of friction where a lot of police officers at the time felt that the officers they were fired and they shouldn't have been fired. The community thought it was a bad shooting. And it was kind of like our what we're seeing today in 2020. It was Riverside's wake-up call that they had to be more responsible to the community. And so from that, we did actually, in my perspective, we did change our policing model because the community was not going to accept the type of policing that we had in 1998.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Hugh, and then I have another question to follow up on that.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, I must say that our church, Kansas Avenue Church, was instrumental in helping to get some of the changes done, especially Pastor Jesse Wilson was at the forefront in helping getting some of these changes done within the police department and trying to bring the relationship with the Black community and the police department together.
Yeah, definitely. That's one thing that's noted at Kansas Avenue, and we're pretty proud of to get involved in that way. How I see your hand, let me just ask this question. You can kind of chime in on it too as you go with the statement that you have. Following the Taisha Miller incident in 1998, some of the things that were to come up. Well, one of the things is the Riverside Coalition for Police Accountability, and as I said before, some of those meetings have taken place at Kansas Avenue, and they have been ongoing over the years. And if you all can just talk to us about what else has come out of that following the Taisha Miller incident to change some of the policing practices that you just mentioned, Val. So Bill, go ahead and speak, and if you can speak to that, we'd appreciate it too. And then Chief Gonzalez right after.
A number of things that the Department of Justice ordered the Riverside Police Department to do. The city itself came up with a group called the Community Police Review Commission. And this was a group of people, citizens, that oversaw police complaints and further investigated officer-involved shootings. I happened to be selected for that particular group of 9 people and stayed on the commission for about 5 years. And when I got off of the commission, the Riverside Coalition for Police Accountability had already formed, and they asked me to join them, and I joined them and still a member of that group today. And we make recommendations and things of that nature to the police department and the Community Police Review Commission, which still is in existence today. So there's a lot of things that took place after the shooting, but it's too time consuming to go into everything. So maybe somebody else will mention along the line.
Go ahead, Chief.
Yeah, thank you. And it's wonderful to have the folks that are on this panel because they've already given the historical perspective. When I first started working the East Side, I was an area commander of the East Side, and if you don't know the history, you're not going to get it. You need to understand what happened in 1971 with the ambush murder. You have to understand how the community was treated during that time, and why they feel the way they do about the police department. So we've made strides, but when Taisha Miller happened, I was a police officer here. What happened after that was we did not have the relationships with the community that we needed at the time. It was too little too late. It's like, hey, we want to go meet with the church now. We want to meet with, the African-American clergy members. We want to meet with the community. And it's like, well, now you want to meet with us? So we were behind the 8 ball when it came to having those relationships within the community when all hell's breaking loose. And we want to be able to make sure that when something happens from this point on, we want to be sure I can make a phone call, I can have a meeting, I can meet with folks and say, here's what's going on. Give them more information than they will hear on the news or on social media. So we've worked very hard in the last 22 years to continue to establish those relationships within our community, not just the East Side, but our entire community. So I know that when something happens, I can make a call and say, here, this is what's going on. Here's what our officers did, or here's what I'll tell them as much as I possibly can without jeopardizing the integrity of the investigation. And if we get into it later, I can talk about what we did as far as logistically with a consent decree after Taisha Miller. Those were many changes, but we did go through that. So the challenge for me has been, since the George Floyd incident this entire year, is without sounding defensive. I try not to sound defensive, but there's this national narrative that's going on out there that says, you need to do this, you need to do that. And I say, hey, listen, we were Minneapolis in 1998. We felt it. We were the people they were talking about. And it wasn't just police, it was specific police officers at the Riverside Police Department. They knew who we were. They knew who the certain officers were. We were the target. So we did sweeping reform. Riverside Police Coalition for Police Accountability, I meet with them regularly. Bill will tell you that. I have for a while. And they were there since the beginning, but they were formed because of Taisha Miller. And my challenge now is to tell people, like I said, without sounding defensive, that yes, I know you want us to do this, I know you want to, but we have been doing this. And I'm not saying, hey, we're good, because we can always get better. But I want to make sure people realize, when you talk about some of the things like the 8 can't wait and civilian oversight, things that we've already put into place for 20 years. But at the same time saying, I'm open for any other suggestions to continue to do better, because we have to do better. But I will say this, in summarizing it, is the relationships with our community have strengthened so much. And it is people like Val Graham and Bill Howe, the ones that we have connections with in the community, where we can reach out and say, hey, this happened. Can you call Del Roberts for me? I learned a lot from Woody Rucker Hughes. Everybody remembers Woody. I learned so much from her when I was an area commander. I still remember the things that she told me to help me get through some of the crises that we're dealing with this year. I'm not the smartest guy in the department by far, but I feel like I'm drawing off of all 28 years of experience every day just to get through the day and get the department through the day. So.
Yeah, and I want to thank you all for coming on, to talk about this, especially you, Chief, being the chief of police in Riverside. You could have said, I'm too busy, send somebody else or something like that. So it really says a lot to us for you to come on here and to be willing to speak to us, so that, that helps strengthen relationships, to have your face visible and to be able to hear your voice. And so we thank you for that. You mentioned Minneapolis and some things that happened in Ferguson, Missouri, and we can go down the list. And coming out of that is this talk about defunding the police. Now, some people that gets them really upset, and other people, they say, well, it doesn't actually mean defund. It means to reallocate funds and things like that. And so with the Riverside Police, I know that you all have some things that you do. As you mentioned, you have the Community Service Bureau and some other things that go on in terms of youth to youth and opportunity with education and other things that you all do to help, strengthen your relationships with the community. And you are already doing a lot of things, as you mentioned. And in the past 22 years, you have certainly come a long way in terms of relationships with the community. Now, from you all's perspective as law enforcement officers, when you hear the term defund the police, what does it mean to you? What does it say to you? And do you see some light in some of the things that it really means, in terms of maybe we should allocate some funding to mental health awareness or other social workers or various things like that? There's all types of things that people have talked about, because this is what the public hears. The public hears that the New York City Police Department has like a $6 billion per year budget. The LA Police Department has a $3 billion per year budget. I don't know what the Riverside Police Department budget is, but when we hear billions of dollars, we say, well, can't you take 100 million of that and put it towards something else that may be, it may be better spent to help prevent crime, or really if people aren't committing serious offenses that we don't have to call the police, who may go and escalate a situation. So talk to us about, what do you hear when we talk about defunding the police?
I could probably start off and I'll get the rest of it. I don't want to keep talking.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I'll tell you what's currently going on with Riverside Police Department. And we're about $135 million budget. And I did get that. I got a lot of the defunding the police, but we're a 400-person sworn officer department, 590 employees. So I call it a preemptive strike, whatever you want. But when this was coming out, I'm like, we're actually allocated for 410 officers. We guess what the biggest concern that the community has right now is homelessness. and mental health issues. That's all I hear. If I have 20 meetings next week, I'll talk about it at all 20. So a little bit of, like I say, call it a preemptive strike if you want, but I thought, I do agree with, I don't want to call it defunding. I call it reallocating, reimagining, whatever you want to say. But they allowed us to get up to 412 sworn officers because they liked the way our homeless outreach team was working, our public safety engagement team, which goes out and we don't just arrest people. We go to encampments, we provide services. We try to get them to a place where they can get help. And I know that's going to be huge. It's going to last for as long as I'm here. And I said, well, I know you want to give us more officers for that. But I did this. I went to the council and said, I'll give up a couple police officer positions right now out of my budget. Take it and resource it, reallocate it for mental health professionals, nurses, whatever you want to do, as long as they stay with my team. As long as they're going to go out with the homeless, I don't want to just give up police officer positions, but I want to reallocate the money because it's going to help us and it's going to help the community because we know it's a huge issue. It's a nationwide issue that everybody's dealing with across the country. So as far as reallocating, I did agree with that. I mean, we can reallocate resources. We're going through our Office of Homeless Solutions, and you guys, they're going to put in nurses that are going to go out with our teams to help provide more resources and get the help that folks need out there that are experiencing homelessness. But I'll let everybody else talk about how they feel about defunding. But there was definitely a reallocation that was done by Riverside PD already.
All right, thank you. Brother Oliver, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm in favor of the reallocation. This is something I've been talking about in my classes since the spring to the summer, and now with my classes at RCC. It's very, very blunt in this particular area. And see, the thing that I believe is that it's time now to begin to rethink about the role and responsibility of law enforcement officers. There's too much on that plate. If I were as a police chief, and I would have to be in a position of civil service, not at will, because I realize it's at will. If I don't satisfy the majority of the city council, I'm out. But what I would be advocating is that if as soon as officers leave or whatever, I am replacing that position like Chief Gonzalez is talking about with someone who is social work, mental health trained. And we have talked about this back and forth in the classroom. Well, this person will not be armed. No, the person will not be armed. But see, the thing of it is, I would not be sending my officer to every call that comes in. That means dispatch, along with the watch commander, is going to have to be much more in tune with exactly where we're sending our officers into. I would not be sending officers into 5150s, period. It ain't going to happen.
Explain to us what a 5150 is, please.
That's a mentally ill individual that's suffering from a mental health disorder. Yeah. And so that means that the person is either suicidal, homicidal, or off their meds. Well, that's not the good place to send an officer, because what will happen is that the family who called you, as soon as you arrive, they step back and say, you handle it. No, you're not going to relinquish that and hand it off to us. So in this area, I'm very much in favor of reallocation, but there's something else that's going on here, is that there's a culture in law enforcement that I don't believe you're going to be able to change. I don't believe you're going to be able to reform the culture of policing. It is too ingrained. We've got strong police unions, etc. So no matter who the leader might be, a Chief Gonzalez or whoever the case might be, to really get in there and begin to reimagine how a department can be run. And I would just throw out two particular departments. Cambridge, New Jersey, look at their reformation, but also look at Minneapolis Police Department, because their city council has come in to abolish the police department. And then they found out that it's not as easy as they felt it could be.
Brother Howe, and then Hugh.
Recently, the Riverside Coalition for Police Accountability came across a group of people up in Eugene, Oregon, called In Cahoots.
Difficulty there.
I don't like the acronym, but it stands for Crisis Associates Helping on the Streets. they have formed a group of people, social workers, psychiatrists, nurses, and people like that. And they're in a vehicle and they respond to calls like homelessness and mental health type issues. That's all taken away from the police department. And this has been very successful. They have a call center. When calls come in, the dispatcher screens the call as to whether to send a police officer or to send one of these social workers. And this has been going on up there for about 30 years. We mentioned that to Larry Gonzalez, and I mentioned to Oliver Thompson, and I think they kind of looked into it. But I think it's something seriously that should be looked into. I just heard on the news this week that LA City is starting to look into this type of a program for the LAPD. So maybe this is one of the answers to cut out all these calls they send police officers on dealing with these types of things, because I don't think police officers should be handling the mentally ill and homelessness and things like that. So maybe this is an answer. They up in Eugene, Springfield, Oregon, of course, that's a big college town. They found out that the city spent $2 million a year, but they saved $8.5 million a year on this. So I think that, this may be a partial answer to solve some of our problems.
Go ahead, Hugh.
Police, I believe, can you
Yes,
hear
we can
me?
hear you.
Yeah, I don't believe in the term defunding the police. I believe in reallocating funds, as the chief said. And I'm happy to hear that the chief is reallocating funds for mental health. As a matter of fact, I'm looking at the chat here, and the NAACP in Riverside is talking about an advisory group, chief, that you are starting along this area. When I was in law enforcement, I worked in the jail system. And the people with mental illness, we call them unusual behavior. We didn't have any training in how to deal with them. We had to figure it out. So that's why with this new model that's coming on here, where we're getting social workers and therapists to work alongside the police department, or even go out on some of those calls there to work with the individuals who are suffering a crisis. Because once they see someone in a uniform, their antenna goes up, and then things just escalate from there, and it could easily get out of control. So with mental health professionals going in there, know how to work with these individuals, I think it will bring about some of the changes that we want to see. I understand the pushback you'll get, as the other gentleman said, that the chief, whoever the head of the department is, will get pushback from the police union, because they want more officers and less mental health expert, as we see it. So I believe Riverside is going in the right direction. LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, they're talking about, as the chief house said, bringing in mental health experts to go out on these calls instead of sending out sworn officers.
Yeah, I would think from just the outside looking in, of course, that as a police officer, I would rather someone who's trained in some of these other areas to respond to those calls, and let me respond to calls in areas that I'm trained in, and to be available to serve and protect, and not necessarily go to some of these other things that somebody who is, like I said, more trained in those areas. That's what I would think, because I know as a minister where I'm trained, and the things that I do, I'm more comfortable in those areas because I've been trained and I have experience there. And when I'm called to do something that I have no experience or I'm not trained in, then you're uneasy and you kind of fumble and you're trying to figure it out. And mishaps can happen. They're more prone to happen during those times. But it is good to hear that there are some steps that are being taken, and that these things are being looked at, and that they're being taken serious, that the voice of the people is certainly being heard. Brother Oliver.
But I think one of the mistakes we might make, this particular direction is not a panacea for what is a long-term problem. Law enforcement, the policing, maybe the total criminal justice system needs to be reimagined. I'm not so sure that a police chief might be, okay, Larry, I'm gonna say something here. I'm not so sure if a police chief is the best leader in departments. I think it's time for us to start to reimagine what it means when we say to establish justice out of the Constitution. When we say in the Pledge of Allegiance, with liberty and justice for all, what does that mean? Because I think we've got into a model, whether it's traditional or community-based, that still leads us down the rabbit hole. This is just my view of how we go about dealing with the problems in society. And I'm not sure that law enforcement is really the primary or proper agency to deal with the insidious problems in American society.
Now, I've had some conversations with other members of law enforcement, and when some of these things come up, in my experience, they have become defensive. And, you know, we can understand that many times, you know, when we are what we are, we become defensive of it. And some of the things that you just mentioned, Brother Oliver, I think are important for us to look at and listen to. The question that I have is, how powerful is the voice of the people when it comes to change? When individuals are saying, okay, we need some reform with the police, many times police, if they can become defensive and dig in and say, well, this is how we do things. But the people are saying, we don't like how you are policing us. And the people are the ones who pay taxes, this, that, and the other, who that basically funds many of the government, local and national levels. They're funded by our tax dollars. So how powerful is the voice of the people? And can the voice of the people be enough to enact even greater change amongst the way that they are being policed? There are great police forces. There are some that may not be so great. But all in all, how great do you think the voice of the people is? Or do you think that if there's greater change that needs to happen, where can it come from? Where is the groundswell that change can take place from? Go ahead, Val. Let me unmute you there. Go ahead. We can hear you.
That's a great question as far as how can the people affect change for policing. And it's unfortunate, I'm talking nationwide, not Riverside. Nationwide, unfortunately, policing, because we're a very traditional, business. We mimic military, we're paramilitary. And so a lot of policing agencies don't even switch over for community-based policing, although it's 2020. They still have a system of, you call us, we show up, we fix it, and we may or may not tell you what we did. And essentially that's poor customer service. But for the good agencies, and I'd say Riverside, that has adapted through community-based policing, is typically because we have a major incident such as the Taisha Miller incident to force us to do it. So unfortunately in policing, a lot of times, we only make a change when something forces us to do it. And we're seeing nationwide in 2020 throughout major cities because of the Floyd incident and other major incidents where a lot of policing is forced to change and work with the community. And that model is a negative because, like we mentioned, then the police won't change unless they're forced to do it. And I know we mentioned defunding police. If you look at some of the major cities, such as Seattle, Minneapolis, et cetera, it appears, at least my personal opinion, that because they're more traditional, that they're being punished by the city councils and punished by the mayors and the citizens because there's no established base that, say, Riverside, from our incident community policing, we learned from Taisha Miller, and it took us years to get to the point where, like Chief Gonzalez, he had some equity built up. He can go and talk to people where maybe other major cities have not attempted that. So change will come, but it's unfortunate sometimes because of a negative incident. But it's up to policing to not wait for a negative incident, to be proactive to make change. My last point, I kind of look at it like a cruise ship. You can't make a U-turn with a cruise ship quickly or, to capsize, but that's a narrow view. Things can be done overnight. I'm gonna give one example. There's a lot of controversy with the use of chokeholds or neck restraints. Some of the major cities, chiefs of police have been slow to make that simple adjustment, in my personal opinion, because they don't have a lot of equity built up with the communities. And I'm not, throwing a compliment to Chief Gonzalez, but when he was given that situation, he changed it immediately. He didn't make up excuses of we need to study it, we need to look at it, we need to get a committee and things like that. So it can occur quickly, but it depends on the leader.
Gotcha. Thank
I'll just
you. Chief, and then Brother Oliver, go ahead.
And Val hit a good point. Is yes, we felt like we were forced to make the change during Taisha Miller. Now the good news is our new guys that we've been hiring, and I do think it starts at the top with your leadership, because you have to talk to your young officers and tell them what your expectations are and what type of a person you are and what my philosophy is on policing, and it's all about the community. These folks that we're hiring now, they don't know any different. This is what they're learning. We learned something different and went through radical change in 1998. And cops don't take change very well. And like I said, in the last 22 years, the folks that we're hiring is they get this instilled to them at a very early time in their career. In the academy, they learn something, they get the foundation. But when they get out of the academy, we give them a 3-week orientation before they even go to their field training officer to make sure they get the values of the Riverside Police Department instilled to them that, hey, it's all about the community. And yes, the community does have a huge voice with us. We are their walking, talking tax dollar. We understand that. They are paying for our salaries. But there's the flip side is we also have to give the educational component. We can't just say, like you said earlier, Pastor Jenkins, you get defensive. Well, no, of course. How are we not? We're going to have to shoot rubber bullets if they're throwing fireworks at us. Of course. No, educate them first. If you have those relationships with the community and say, under these circumstances, we would do this, or this is true, or this is not true. I got a lot of things about, you shouldn't throw gas on crowds of people. That was another one in the national narrative. We've never thrown gas in a crowd at Riverside Police Department. Chief Gonzalez, you should have civilian oversight. We've had civilian oversight for 20 years. So, like I said, without sounding defensive, it's just an educational part that we have to make sure we continue. If you have the relationships established, it's easy. They call you, hey, let me go to your meeting next week and I'll tell you what we're doing now. So it's just about those lines of communication. As long as you have those established, you can work through anything, and move forward. So I think we had a question there too. So Dr. Thompson, I think did.
Yeah, Brother Oliver, and I know Pastor McBride wanted to chime in. Go ahead.
You asked the question, do the people? My response is, which people? U.S. Constitution says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, da-da-da-da-da-da. That's not talking about all the community. There's a recent article that was put out by the Public Policy Institute of California. It talked about the changing role of race relations and the police. Just came out within the last month or so. Who are at the top in more support of law enforcement? White people. Next in line, Latinos. Next in line, Asians. Who was at the bottom and has continually been at the bottom? The African-American community. I'm sorry, I have to challenge people in this area. The African-American people are not listened to within government or in law enforcement. Now, Chief doing a good job, but I'm still saying is that when you really listen to, when BLM steps up and talks about Campaign Zero and the Breathe Act, et cetera, and all of that kind of stuff, are they really listened to as to what the problems are, or does somebody then throw in, well, blue lives matter, well, all lives matter. Well, yeah, but see, that's not the issue. The issue is young Black men and brown men are being killed and they are unarmed. And so when you say the community, you have to be very careful as to who is speaking and what side of the fence are they speaking from.
That's interesting information that you brought up there, Doc, because I'm very excited to hear what the chief is talking about and the changes that are happening. The Taisha Miller situation, I didn't know about it. And I'm sitting here just trying to make sure I just get caught up on it. But it's almost as if, as you said, Val, something's got to happen before it turns into a catalyst so they can make sure that other things are happening. So I want to ask this to the chief. and to any of you, whatever the community or the culture is in the police department, how do you make that change? How do you cause your officers to start wanting to respect the community that's out there? But then also, because Chief, I'm sure you can say what you want to say, but then you got your lieutenants and those that are under you who also have to carry your message. So, for instance, Kenny Anderson asked a question. We often hear that good cops need to hold bad cops accountable for misdeeds. What specific measures are taken to ensure that this happens? And what is your level of confidence that transgressors are held accountable? Talk about the culture inside there now with your officers.
Well, culture it's a thing. You're absolutely right. It is. It's something and then I've seen it change at our department dramatically, like we've said over and over in 1998 with the Taisha Miller thing. So how do we make sure that we're screening the right folks that we hire? How do we because everybody's got prejudices. We can all agree on that. Everybody has them. It's in you. We talk about implicit bias training, procedural justice training. These are things that identify those things that we all have inside of us, and we have to learn how to deal with. But can I screen that in a psychological exam? Can I screen that in a polygraph? We do as best as we possibly can. There was a bill that was passed that the governor signed about an extra layer in the psychological examination, specifically on racial inequalities and any type of racial tendencies somebody might have, where they're going to delve into that a little bit more than they normally do. But after they get through the process, it's a matter of, like you said before, Pastor, I have to make sure that my command staff, the chiefs and captains and lieutenants, know that what our vision is, and it's not a hard sell for me by any means. We're all on the same page. We all want to be a better department. We've been through this before, like I said. And all of our commands, all the guys that the lieutenants hire, they've lived through Taisha Miller. So we've made these changes. We want to make sure it's instilled in our officers. And I get it. You can't psychologically screen every single one. As long as we continue to hire from the human race, we're going to have problems. But for us to be able to supervise that, mitigate those problems, it takes strong supervision throughout it starts with leadership, but it starts with strong supervision throughout all the ranks. And I'll even target the street sergeants the most that are keeping tabs on everything going on a daily basis and trying to identify any type of problem like that early on in their career, to where we don't have to deal with something like you heard it with the George Floyd. This officer had 18 something complaints, and I can confidently say that would not happen in our department. We have things in place now to where we can identify problems like that early on and make sure, because it is true, good cops do not want bad cops. These guys, our officers don't want to be on the front page of the news. They don't want to be known nationwide as a racist department. But we police ourselves, I think, better than most.
So let me ask this question and a follow-up. Another question came up. Who's training the new officers? Is it you kind of alluded to it, because you're saying everybody kind of lived through the Taisha Miller situation, but who do we have there making sure that this new culture is pervaded, is going through to the younger guys coming in? Let's say I'm coming in now, I want to get involved, I want to be, I don't just want to see my officer at Starbucks, but I actually want to be one of those guys.
Yeah.
Who's training me?
So one of the most important positions in our department is the field training officer. Those are senior officers that train our young officers. And that's where they go through 6 months of training before they're out on their own. Yes, they go through a police academy. You get good foundational training on the law, tactics, physical fitness, things like that. But you really learn the job when you're on the street, because every city has their own culture. They have their own way of doing things. So we have to make sure we're identifying the best persons for the field training program, that they are going to deliver the message that we want to deliver, to where they can train these young officers. So we're very conscientious of who we select to be field training officers, line supervisors for young officers.
Got you. Val, you had your hand up.
Yes, as we have to go back to culture as well, culture of department. To give you an example, I started in 1986 with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, and there were a few minorities, and particularly Black deputies at the time, sworn deputies at the time. I remember seeing Chief Oliver Thompson in the academy as a captain, and it was unheard of to see a command level person in 1986. I also remember in 1986 in the academy, when I came to Riverside County Sheriff's Department, we had less than 10 Black male sworn deputies at all levels throughout the whole department. And at the time, keep in mind it's 1986, over 33 years ago, they had culture, and I remember training officers telling me, one right, one deputy. That was the culture. That's how tough you're supposed to be. I come over to the Riverside Police Department in 1989. I'm just showing culture. One of my training officers took me to a bar to see if I can fight and intentionally get into a fight. That was the culture in 1989. But keep in mind, and this is my personal opinion, back then, most deputies and officers had a military background. And so it was more of a tough guy type of culture. I didn't think twice of it, keeping in mind I'm in my early 20s. You fast forward, by the time I retire in 2019, we're not looking for that officer, he or she, who can get into a bar fight. We're not looking for that officer to go to a riot by themselves. So I had seen the culture change, but I also see that as a young deputy, as a young officer, I had no one to turn to. If my deputy, if my training officer, when I see me get in a fight and see if I was tough, that's what you did. That was appropriate back then. And so my personal opinion is the culture is based off the leaders to make sure that the current training officers are really, really get into these new recruits that we're about working with people instead of how tough you should be.
I want to ask this question because I see it coming up in the comments. Where are we at with our ratio between Black officers, white officers, and things of that nature in Riverside? Are we seeing our Black officers being promoted more? What are we doing about that, Chief?
Well, we're actually pretty close to parity with every department wants to directly reflect your community, which still isn't enough. I mean, if we have, we're at 8 or 9% African-American community in Riverside, we're about 9 or 10% African-American police officers, which is still not enough. The one thing that we're a little bit behind on is we have a little bit less Latino officers than we do that reflect the community. But as far as white officers community, it's all pretty close. As far as promotion to the ranks, I take that into serious consideration. It's one thing that it's a never-ending battle, but I can tell you this: we have a strong group of minority candidates that are coming up through the ranks now at Riverside PD. You're going to see in the future, in the very near future, them move up the ranks. And just a side note, if you guys can say a prayer, we lost an absolute warrior and a wonderful African-American detective the other night, a guy named Ron L. Newton. If you guys can keep him in his prayers, that was a huge loss for the department. We lost him to cancer. He's 36 years old. He has a 7-year-old son, Elijah. But he was one of those ones that definitely you would have seen move up the ranks. So I'm sorry, that's a side note. I want to keep in the prayers. I know I got pastors on here, but yeah, it's something we're very conscientious of because we want to make sure, because you can't recruit minority candidates. They want to be able to come into a department and say, I want to be like Lieutenant Graham. That guy's a lieutenant. I want to be like Chief Thompson. I want to be like Chief Howe. They made it up the ranks and they look like me. I understand that. And that's something we have to do. We have to continue to make sure we identify and promote through the ranks to where, because it helps at the top, but it also helps the recruitment efforts as well, if that makes sense.
Do me a favor, guys. I'm the youth pastor at Kansas Avenue, and I have to, I talk with the young people here and there. But talk to me about young people's engagement with officers. If I'm seeing one, if one is seeing me, if I all of a sudden I look and they look and I've got an oh shoot look on my face, how do I engage with an officer that's coming to engage with me? What's my response? How am I supposed to, whether I'm right or wrong, what are the things that are going to make sure that me as a young African-American man survive this confrontation or this engagement, whether I'm in the wrong or in the right? Go ahead, Hugh, then Val.
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say for you to do is not be scared of the officer. If you're going to get pulled over, well, first, if you're going to get pulled over by an officer and you see that he's going to pull you over, What I recommend is that as soon as you pull over, put all your windows down. Keep your hands on the steering wheel. When the officer comes up to you, acknowledge the officer is present. Don't give the officer any lip or any reason for him to give you a lip back, and then it starts a confrontation. So acknowledge his presence, and whatever he asks you to do, just simply comply with it. I've seen a lot of YouTube video about knowing your rights when the police pull you over and being difficult with them. It doesn't make sense being difficult with them because it's only going to turn out bad 99% of the time. So just follow their directions. If it's at night, I would do the same thing. You put all your windows down, all 4 windows down, your hands on the steering wheel, but before you do that, you turn your dome light on so the officer can see inside. That simply put the officer at ease. It put you at ease. I was just driving cross country recently, and I got pulled over. The police officer followed me for 5 miles, just looking for something to pull me over. So he found a reason. I wind my window down, asked him what was the problem. He told me he couldn't read my license plate. Now I could easily have been smart with him, but instead I didn't get smart with him. He asked for my driver's license and registration. I just simply showed it to him. I had all my windows down. He could see in my car. And this was in Arkansas, someplace in the middle of nowhere, you know. So he saw in my car that there was no threat to him. He didn't even take my license to the back to run it. He gave it right back to me. We ended up start talking about something else. Have a good day. You're on your way. But if I had come at him in a negative way, then it would have been a much different story. So that's my suggestion to all young people. Whenever if you believe you're going to get pulled over, if you get pulled over, just put all your windows down, put your hands on the steering wheel, and be respectful at all times.
Go ahead, Val.
You know, one thing, and you used the term engage, and it's interesting that right before I retired, I was working with a lot of schools, Riverside City Schools, and we have a program called Engage, ironically. It's called Engage. And since I've retired, Chief Gonzalez has allowed me to continue to use a lot of his minority officers who worked with me. And prior to COVID-19, we had Hispanic and Black and other minority officers, and we would go to city schools and county schools and just talk about policing honestly, more so they can see themselves. It's such a huge thing to see yourself as a Black officer, a Hispanic officer, an Asian officer, and just listen and take questions, because there's not a lot, not just Riverside, nationwide, typically there's not a lot of minority officers with the exception of big cities. And so having kids be able to ask questions, like you said, what do I do when I get pulled over, and having a Black officer tell him or her has a different effect than maybe a white officer, although the information may be the same. So for me, again, as a young deputy and later a young officer, when I saw a Black command staff officer, I don't care, sergeant, lieutenant, or higher, it made an impression on me, even if I didn't speak to that person, because I saw myself. And so you need to have officers willing to talk to schools and things of that nature, so the minorities will have a reason they might want to join police officers, or if not, at least be more comfortable because they see you as themselves and someone that's not going to harm you.
All right. We're getting ready to wrap up here. We're going to allow Brother Oliver to say a word, and then Chief, we're going to give you the last word right after that. And Chief, if you can just talk to us about some of the other things that the police department is doing to engage with the community, and let our listeners know if they want to get involved and be part of coalitions and some other things, what it is that they can do. But Brother Oliver, go ahead, and then Chief, if you can close us after that.
My real education in being a law enforcement officer occurred when I left Riverside and went to Inglewood. Everything that you're talking about here is good. But see, when you're thrown into the cauldron of South Los Angeles, the Inglewood, Hawthorne area, Watts, Compton, East Los Angeles, etc., things are tremendously different. And one of the things that I found that made me somewhat, I guess, successful in my time period is there, I started living in the community in 1991. I was the first police chief to live in the city of Inglewood in over 30 years. By living in the community, my neighbors knew who I was. I'm in contact with community groups and all of that kind of stuff. And in this area of officers, one of the biggest problems I have is complicity. Please don't anybody ever tell me that officers don't know who the bad cops are. and this is something I'm preaching in my classes over and over, and I'm not going to stop. If we really want to clean up departments, is that the good officers end up getting rid of overtly, intelligently, and demonstrably. Getting rid of them because they are damage to their reputation as well as to law enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you. Chief Gonzalez.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. That makes a lot of sense too. Excuse me. In closing, I'll just say that forums like these are wonderful for me, and I know you thank me, Pastor Jenkins. I wouldn't miss something like this. No matter what I was doing, it's that important to me to help me continue to establish those relationships in our community, to know that I am here for our community and our department is. It means more than anything else does, more than what I have my boss, the city management team, we have council and stuff like that, but it's all about the community. They're the ones that they're the constituency that talks to council and talks to my bosses. But more importantly, I can just reassure the community that your police department will continue to foster these relationships, work with these relationships to move forward. And when we do have ideas, and I have an advisory committee that meets once a month, and they're from all over the city, all different shapes and sizes, all different belief systems. There's spirited debates that are on there, but I want to hear it. I want to make sure I'm not going to give you a canned answer to say, oh yeah, we'll take care of that. We'll do that. No, here's why we can or can't do that. But tell me what your concerns are, or tell me what you've heard, because just like with us, we might hear something. And unfortunately, in the social media, here's some of my concerns. Some of the social media things that come out. You could say the most outlandish thing in the world, and at least 4 or 5 people will believe it and send it out to everybody else that they know. So we have to work extra hard at making sure we communicate with the community. We make sure we have these dialogue sessions. We make sure we post things that are truthful on our social media. Because that's a huge part. All of us on this call, I don't think any of us had to deal with that when we first started, but it's a reality now. But I just want to make sure that the community understands that we do listen. We understand that you're the ones that drive us. We are your police department, and it is very different. Dr. Thompson said, you go to LA, they're dealing with things that we are not dealing with, and then we're dealing with things that they're not dealing with. But overall, I can say, because the relationships we fostered over the last 20 years, and even before that, that we have a very supportive community. I know that, and I think it's because that we're open for dialogue. We're honest with everybody. If we mess up, I'll tell you we messed up. It's hard to say that, but yeah, we made a mistake. But if you guys have any type of recommendations like that we can do in the future, then we'll absolutely consider it. It's not just like just the facts, man, or it's on a need to know basis and you don't need to know. Those days are long gone. We have to have these open dialogue sessions, and it's forums like these where I learn something every single time I'm on them, whether it's from the panelists or from the community comments. So I appreciate it. I'm always here for our community, in any capacity. If there's any type of, like the Riverside Police Accountability Coalition for Police Accountability, I told them I'd love to meet with them monthly. We meet about every other month now. But it's things like that will help us continue to be a good police department. I'm proud of this. It's the only police department I've been with. I'm proud of it. I'm proud of our officers. I think that we're the kind of the go-to police department in the region. People look us for ideas and training and everything like that to move forward. And I want to continue that and just make it better. So that's all I have. And I would entertain any questions.
No, we appreciate it. I
Definitely.
think that we have, gotten a lot out today, discussed some important things, and our listeners have been very appreciative, and we can see it in the comments, and there's lots of questions there in the comments as well that we couldn't get to, and there's some other questions that we wanted to ask those who are a part of the panel that we couldn't get to, but I do think that we have had a good discussion today, and I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out to talk to us and to enlighten us, to inform us, to make us a little more wise, and to also listen to us and to what we're saying. Pastor McBride, then I want to talk about some things that we're going to get into on next week.
All right, guys. So for those of you who are watching, this has been the conversation. We're back with the emergency response, and we have dealt with some of the changes that have happened in the Riverside Police Department. And we've really touched on the fact that the Taisha Miller situation really was a pivotal change for the Riverside Police Department. While it was extremely unfortunate that that situation took place the way it did, as you all know, sometimes it takes a climatic situation to help turn a big ship like this one around. And it's been turned around in such that we're seeing some great community involvement. And we're hoping, we're continuing to keep our prayers up, fingers crossed, whatever we need to do to make sure that as our police officers here in the RPD deal with you, our community, that they are careful to make sure that everybody goes home. That's right, everybody goes home. The officers go home safe, we go home safe, you go home safe, because what's most important is that we understand that we all are in this together. Now, while we are dealing with this pandemic of Black lives and this issue of racism going on, we have a chief police that is saying that he is sensitive to those concerns, that he and his department are continuing to work on ways to continue to strengthen their department. He's not saying we've done this, we've done that. He's done his best, even right here, to make sure that he did not come across defensive, but that most of all, he helped to ensure that you, our community, know that they're continuing to work on their issues. We've had great comments by Val and the good doc above. I wanted to call him Black Santa Claus, but he came at me, so let's swipe that off. He is not, but he is a great teacher, helping our community to understand right here in this community that you're living in, to understand that, listen, our police officers are not to be afraid of, but while there are systemic issues that we've got to deal with, most of all, you need to begin to develop a trusting relationship with them. We had Hugh and we had the great Chief Doc Howell on here. Listen, Hugh walked us through the idea of what it means to be stopped by the officers. And that is not to be afraid of them. Go ahead and show them that you have nothing to hide. And if they have something that they want to pull out and get you for, listen, your cooperation makes a big difference. Chief Hugh, man, listen, your example, not just with these guys here, but your example in our church continues to let us know, sir, that, listen, the police department is not completely racist. They definitely do look out for not just the officers, but the community. And it's your example, sir, that continues to keep young men like myself and other men behind me and before me looking at our police department with a bit of admiration and willingness to want to take part of it. Chief Gonzalez, if you continue to keep this transparent approach, let me tell you, sir, I believe that your time in the office here will be a lengthy one, and it will continue to grow by leaps and bounds. If you continue to look at information with both open eyes and continue to pull your officers into that culture where we see the community as our friends and as some people that we can look at, we can be an example to the rest of the world that, listen, change can happen. And as you said, Val, it can happen overnight. You can turn it around. You can look at something, you don't have to make the excuses about, oh, we got to take that into a meeting. No, some things can stop immediately, and we want to appreciate you for making sure that some of those things stop immediately, and then by going on to begin to make the change for some of those things that don't stop immediately. Listen, guys, you've joined us for the conversation. I'm going to turn it back over to our main host. He is none other than my brother in ministry, Pastor Michael Jenkins. Doc, you're muted there. We can't hear you.
All right, simple mistake. Next week, when we come together, we're going to be talking about On the Ballot. And that's what the conversation is titled. And we're going to be talking about talking with experts about the 2020 ballot props. We have Alan Reinach and Damon Brown, who is a Compton City attorney. We also have a Compton City Mayor, Adja Brown, and Ken Stewart, who is running for office in Riverside. We're just going to be talking about ballot props, things that you are to be informed about, things that we all need to know about. And we want to encourage everyone to go out and vote. Please go out and vote if you're not registered. Get registered and make sure that you vote. Turn in your mail-in ballot. Go down to the polling station on that November the 3rd, I believe is when it is, that first Tuesday in November, and cast your ballot. And so we want to make sure that we are participating in the process. So that is going to be the conversation on next week. So make sure that you spread the word. And then following the conversation at the Candace Avenue Church in the parking lot, we're going to have an outdoor concert, social distancing. You can remain in your cars. We will have some chairs out, but we encourage you to bring your own chairs, bring some hand sanitizer, wear a mask, but also dress in camouflage clothing. Come out dressed in your camouflage and let's enjoy an outdoor concert next week at the Kansas Avenue Church right there in the parking lot. We invite everybody who's part of this panel to come out and to spread the word to your family and friends as well. So I just want to say one more time, thank you to each and every one of you for taking time to talk with us today and to be part of this conversation and to help strengthen the relationship between the community and the Riverside Police Department. Amen. We're going to close out with a word of prayer. Let's all bow our heads. Father in heaven, thank you for being in the midst of this conversation today and to help strengthen the relationship between the police and the community. I pray, Lord, that you would be with every police officer, that you would protect them, and that you would be with citizens as well, that we all could live together and work together in society, and that we could make it a safer place for everybody. We thank you for Chief Gonzalez, and I pray that you would be with him as he leads the Riverside Police Department, and that you would be with every member in City Council, from the mayor all the way down to the person who's just sweeping floors. Lord, that Riverside would be a great place, and that every community surrounding Riverside and the IE that we call home would follow suit, and that it would be a safe place for all of us and a joyous place to live and to work each and every day. Bless each and every one of these individuals that have been part of this panel today and their endeavors in life, and please be with their families. And Lord, remember the police officer that was mentioned that he just lost his life to cancer. I pray that you would be with his family, his child that is left behind. And Lord, I just pray that you would strengthen that child and that you would place a hedge around that child, that child would grow and to know love despite his father being gone, and that he would know love because of those that are around him, and that those that are in his life continue to bless them and strengthen them. We ask and pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you, everyone. God bless you. May you have a wonderful rest of your day today.